In the 1920s and 30s, there were several neo-behaviorists who were helping carve out the path for this school of thought. I won't cover all of them, of course, in this lecture. We don't have time, but I do want to show you some of the work of Clark Hull. I think his ideas are interesting, and he did have a significant impact on behaviorism. So let's take a look at some of Hull's contributions. Clark Hull was born in New York in what your textbook calls pioneer conditions. His family was extremely poor. As a young boy, he had typhoid fever and polio. Both of these diseases resulted in some physical disabilities and some psychological limitations as well. Despite his poor health and despite his poor finances, he was an incredibly ambitious young man and wanted nothing more than to make a career for himself. He was very much interested in engineering, the design and construction of things when he was a young boy, and he carried that passion for engineering throughout his life, even as he contributed to the field of psychology. In 1918, during World War I, he earned his PhD from the University of Wisconsin. He worked with Joseph Jastrow, who studied with G. Stanley Hall. Jastrow taught Hull about Darwin's ideas, about Hall's ideas. Jastrow had a big impact on some of the early psychologists. For this reason, Hull was influenced by Charles Darwin, Ivan Pavlov, John Watson, and Edward Thorndike. Now, I don't talk about Thorndike in the behaviorism lecture. I do want to emphasize that he is considered a contributor to behaviorism, but he is also associated with functionalism. That's why we talked about Thorndike a few lectures ago. Thorndike is the bridge between functionalism and behaviorism, so keep that in mind. But all of these people influenced Hull's ideas, and he would eventually be considered a neo-behaviorist by historians in the field of psychology. After he was introduced to psychology and the experimental method, he created a machine that could calculate correlations between variables, an early version of SPSS. In 1929, Hull started working at Yale University at its Institute of Human Relations. It was here that he started to develop his learning theory. His major idea was that human behavior could be explained with mathematical laws. When you think of Hull, I want you to think of math, and I want you to think of Isaac Newton. Newton had a similar idea when it came to physics and mechanics, not human behavior. Newton believed that math could be used to explain things like motion, physics, mechanics. Hull tried to apply a similar idea, that we could explain the way the mind works and the reason for behavior using math, using these fancy equations. And so we'll look at some of those equations on the next slide. But first, I wanted to explain this mechanical idea of Hull's. He also said that we would never truly understand human behavior unless we were able to build a machine, a robot, that acted just like humans. If we could get to that point where we could create a robot, not like Hollywood robots, but like a robot that no one would be able to know is not human, if we are able to do that, then we know we fully understand human behavior. At first, this idea may sound a bit unusual, but if you think about it, what he's trying to say is that we will never fully understand human behavior. It is so complex. There are so many moving parts, but he understood that we are very limited in our ability to fully explain human behavior. It is just way too complex to be able to fully capture with some mathematical equations. He still tried, but also recognized some of those limitations. The GIF that you can see here on your slide is an illustration of where we are today in terms of building robots that mimic humans. This particular robot has been designed to express some of the universal human emotions like happiness and surprise and fear. But we are a long way away from creating a machine that acts exactly like human beings. Hull earned his PhD in 1918 during World War I, and then he worked in the 20s, in the 30s, in the 40s to try to expand behaviorism through his own work. In 1943, he published a book and outlined 16 different principles of behavior. Now, we're not going to go through all 16 principles, but I do want to show you some of his ideas and then show you a few examples to illustrate those ideas. Like many behaviorists at the time, he tried to explain behavior through these associations between stimulus and response, between the S and the R. He said these associations grow, strengthen through learning. That's the process that is responsible for creating these associations. And the strength of this association, he called habit strength. So he sort of referred to that association as a habit and then called the strength of that habit strength. And he had a little formula that he used to designate this strength. According to Hull, habit strength is higher when there are reinforcers present, when those reinforcers serve to minimize or eliminate a biological drive, hunger, thirst, rest. And when the number of reinforced trials is higher than when it's lower. If you're trying to teach your pet how to do a trick, you know that some type of reward must be present. It's really hard to teach an animal how to do anything if you don't show the animal that what they're doing is a good thing. Some of us use treats, praise, play to reward our animals and encourage them to keep doing what we're asking them to do. When we practice again and again, when those trials are many instead of few, our animal tends to learn. Over time, through repeated trials and the presence of rewards, especially food rewards, over time, habit strength can grow. And this is how learning happens. Learning is a gradual accumulation of habit strength. It happens slowly over time. The more trials, the more practice, the more those trials are reinforced, the more likely that the strength grows and the animal learns. Here is another one of Hull's equations, reaction potential. This is the probability that a given reaction will occur given the situation. So think of it like, what is the potential for a specific reaction? What is the likelihood that the pigeon will actually peck at the ping pong ball? He believed there was an equation that we could use to calculate this probability. And I have that information here on the slide for you. Now, the real equation is more complicated than what I have here, but essentially, reaction potential, the likelihood that an animal or a human will behave in a certain way, is a function of several different variables: habit strength, drive, their motivation, how hungry they are, both literally and figuratively, and the incentives, the reinforcers, the rewards that are present. According to Hull, reaction potential is high when all three of these variables are high: when the organism is driven, when rewards are present, and when habit strength, which we just talked about on the previous slide, when habit strength is high. That same behavior is less likely when habit strength is low, when drive is low, and when there are no rewards present. It is very unlikely that the organism will exhibit that response. It's not impossible. It just means that it's very unlikely. The potential is very low. Let's take a look at two examples to help illustrate Hull's ideas. What is the reaction potential that a hungry child will cry when grandma or grandpa doesn't buy them candy in the checkout aisle? In our example, the stimulus is going to be the word no. That's going to be the trigger, the point at which the child will have to decide how to respond. The response that we're looking at, the response that we're trying to predict, is crying. That association for children is pretty high. The word no triggers crying or whining or screaming or sometimes getting kicked in the shin. This strength then is probably high for our example. There's a strong connection between the S and the R, between the stimulus and the response. Plus, we also know that the child is hungry. They're in a grocery store with grandma, they're hungry, cranky. That drive, that hunger drive, is going to be higher in this situation than it would right after eating a meal. There are several reinforcers available in the environment: grandma's attention, whether it's positive or negative, and the candy. If both of these things are provided, if the grandparent coddles the child, if the grandparent ends up buying the candy, they are reinforcing that behavior because they are strengthening the association between no and crying. It not only creates a problem in that instant, but in the future, according to Hull, it's going to be more likely then that the crying happens because of no. So in our example, because all three of the things that he said needed to be present are present, there's a high likelihood that this child is going to cry when grandma says no. The problem is, of course, human behavior is not as systematic as physics and mechanics, and humans are full of all kinds of idiosyncrasies and complexities that make it so that we can't predict with 100% certainty how someone or how an animal is going to behave in a specific situation. We can get really close, but we can't do it with 100% certainty. Let's look at another example. Example number 2. What is the reaction potential that a student with a 4.0 GPA, 100% in the class, and perfect attendance, what's the likelihood that the student will skip class on a beautiful day? The stimulus that we're looking at in this example is the beautiful day, the weather, and the response that we're trying to predict is the skipping of class, not going to class because the weather is really nice. What's the likelihood that this particular student will skip class? Habit strength is probably low. There have been many beautiful days before, and the student hasn't skipped. That habit, that strength is minimal. In this example, drive is probably low because the student doesn't appear to have any direct needs. They are getting a good grade in the class. Doesn't seem like skipping class would cause many issues with their grade if they skip just this one time. If skipping class will meet the student's need in some way, then we might say drive is high. But the way that the example is presented, let's just assume that drive is low. There is one potential reinforcer here, the idea that skipping class could result in some relaxation. Regardless of whether relaxation is needed, it could be a motivator here. It could be one of the things that will reinforce the behavior. In this example, I would say there's a low probability that the student will skip class on a beautiful day. And really, it just has more to do with this isn't something the student normally does. The student really doesn't need to skip class, isn't driven to skip class. So I would say, using Clark's equation, I would say there's a low probability that this particular student will skip class even on a beautiful day. Of course, there's a lot of variables that I didn't present in this tiny example. So if you added a couple of words, if you added a couple sentences to either one of these examples, it may change how we label habit strength, drive, and reaction potential.